She entered history under a name that laughs at fate. Hurrem, the cheerful one, the joyful one. A captive of Slavic blood who not only survived the brutal reality of the Ottoman Empire, but stormed it, rewriting the rules of the game for everyone. Her story is not a fairy tale, but a cunning thriller about power, where the heroine transforms from a concubine into the chief political advisor of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, a man before whom the entire world trembled. We know her today largely thanks to a series where drama simmers beneath layers of expensive fabrics and intrigue. It gave her a face, a voice, made her emotions the property of millions. But along with that, it also created a dense fog of myths, especially around her final act. How did the woman who achieved the impossible, forcing the Sultan to marry a slave, becoming the mother of his heirs, and conducting her own diplomatic correspondence with kings, meet her end? This is where the detective story begins, intertwining the dry lines of Ottoman chronicles, the poisonous rumors of European ambassadors, and the brilliant fiction of screenwriters. Hürrem's death in 1558 was not a simple full stop at the end of a life. It became the first act in a bloody drama over Suleiman's legacy, which would ultimately lead to a tragic conclusion among his sons. The true cause of her passing is the key to understanding not only her personality, but also the raw nerves of that era, an era where medicine was an art of guesswork, where poison was considered a standard political tool, and any ruler's weakness instantly turned into a weapon against him.
We embark on an investigation. On one hand, the official version, illness. But what kind? Plague, cancer, infection. The documents are murky. On the other, whispers in the corridors, poisoning. By whom? Jealous viziers, a rival, or even her own son, eager to hasten his path to the throne. And between them, the beautiful, poignant series version, which allowed her to die not as a victim, but as a wise ruler, bidding farewell to the world and her beloved husband. Ready to unravel this tangled skein? We'll set aside the glittering costumes and dramatic close-ups to peer into the lazarettos of the era, decipher the reports of spies, and understand what burden of disease and intrigue Hürrem Sultan truly might have carried on her shoulders. The truth, as always, will prove more complex and multifaceted than any script. O magnificent viewer! Your attention is our true akçe, the precious coin minting this channel's future. To bestow a subscription is an act swift as the swing of a yataghan, yet its mark will endure for centuries. With your support, our scrolls will multiply, and the stories will only grow more captivating. Grant us this favor, bestow your subscription upon the channel, and we shall continue this intellectual feast together. And so, Istanbul, the early 1520s. The Topkapi Harem is not merely a palace, it is the most complex and competitive enterprise of its age. The asset, the Sultan's attention. The investments, beauty, wit, intrigue. The assistants, all too often, poison or a silken cord. At the entrance to this singular world appears a new participant. She is led by the arms, she does not speak the language of this realm, and in her documents lies a pure, unblemished history. Her name was Alexandra, or Anastasia. More precisely, it was. Now she has no name. She is a girl of about 15, a priest's daughter from a backwater Galician village, torn from her familiar life by a Tatar raid like a weed. She has been sold and resold like a trinket, and now she stands at the threshold where faces and destinies are erased.
But here occurs the first plot twist. In this place where humility and obedience were valued, she receives the nickname Hürrem, the laughing one, the joyful one. Imagine this scene: marble halls, the whispers of concubines, important eunuchs, and amid all this Gothic solemnity, a girl who laughs. Not hysterically, but vibrantly. It was not a protest, it was a powerful claim to success. Among the crowd of beautiful slave girls, she became the unforgettable one, with golden hair, blue eyes, and a bold smile. She is noticed not just by the Sultan, she is noticed by Suleiman, young, melancholic, a refined poet who by the age of 26 had already seen much. He, who composed poetry under the pseudonym Muhibi, the Beloved, saw in this laughing Slavic woman not just a trophy, he saw a person, a dialogue. Their story is not a rapid ascent, but a methodical, irreversible shift of tectonic plates in the empire's structure. Hürrem does not simply bear him an heir, she bears him 6 children. Each pregnancy is a consolidation of position, a strategic asset. While other concubines receded into the shadows after giving birth to a son, Hürrem remained at the center. She did what seemed impossible. She became the only one. The Sultan, who could have thousands of women, chose one. Then an explosion. The 1530s. Suleiman performs not just a romantic gesture, he carries out a coup d'état in the realm of family law. He marries a slave, officially, for the first time in the dynasty's history. The Ottoman elite experiences a genuine cultural shock. This broke all the unwritten rules. Hürrem is no longer merely a favorite, she is the Hasseki Sultan. She possesses an official seal, her own court, diplomatic correspondence, and a budget comparable to that of a small province. She writes letters to King Sigismund II August of Poland, deftly advancing Ottoman interests. She negotiates with the Doge of Venice. Her signature on documents carries more weight than that of some pashas. Hürrem is no longer merely a favorite, she is the Hasseki Sultan. She possesses an official seal, her own court, diplomatic correspondence, and a budget comparable to that of a small province. She writes letters to King Sigismund II August of Poland, deftly advancing Ottoman interests. She negotiates with the Doge of Venice. Her signature on documents carries more weight than that of some pashas. Hürrem is no longer merely a favorite, she is the Hasseki Sultan. She possesses an official seal, her own court, diplomatic correspondence, and a budget comparable to that of a small province. She writes letters to King Sigismund II August of Poland, deftly advancing Ottoman interests. She negotiates with the Doge of Venice. Her signature on documents carries more weight than that of some pashas. But each episode of this blockbuster comes at a price. To remain at the pinnacle, one must play the harem game better than anyone else, and Hürrem plays. Her ally becomes not some courtier, but her own daughter, Mirima, whom she marries off to the cunning and unscrupulous Rüstem Pasha. A family office is formed. Hürrem, strategy; Mirima, influence; Rüstem, execution. Together, they become a machine for governing the empire. Their main project? The future, and the future is the throne. Standing in the way of Hürrem's sons was the primary claimant, Shihadze Mustafa, Suleiman's son by another concubine, Mahidevran. Brilliant, beloved by the people and the Janissaries. Intrigues, suspicions of treason, skillfully planted letters. The culmination would be a tragic denouement. Simultaneously, she builds, in the literal sense. The Hasseki Hürrem Sultan complex in Istanbul is not just a mosque and a hospital. It is an entire campaign for influence, carved in stone. A message to her subjects and to history. I am here. I am a founder. I am a benefactress. She crafts a public image of a pious Muslim woman and mother of the nation, cleansing the reputation of the witch from Ruthenia bestowed upon her by her enemies. By the 1550s, Hurrem Sultan was no longer a person, but an institution of power. She sat in her chambers in Topkapi with a view overlooking the Bosphorus and the entire empire. She had won. From a nameless captive, she had become the most influential woman of the century. However, her health, undermined by endless childbirths, stress, and palace poison, literal or metaphorical, historians still debate, began to falter. Chronic pain, weakness, and ailments became her constant companions. The price of the throne is always measured in years of life.
It is this fantastical biography, the journey from absolute zero to absolute power, that became the main reason her death became shrouded in such a thicket of mysteries. To slip away quietly, like a simple old woman, was simply not possible for such a figure. Her end, like her entire life, simply had to be loud, mysterious, and dramatic. Otherwise, the audience would not forgive. Hürrem's later years were not a sunset painted in beautiful colors. They were more like an exhausting marathon over rough terrain, where every achievement was paid for with an attack of pain, and every political triumph was answered by a new fit of coughing in the silence of her chambers. From around 1548, when she was about 45, a substantial age for the 16th century, a quiet but persistent companion entered her life: chronic illness. Ottoman chroniclers are sparing with medical details, but their fragments form an alarming picture. Sources write of a long and agonizing illness. Modern historians, armed with knowledge of the era, read between the lines: debilitating lower abdominal pain, periods of fever, progressive weakness. Many lean toward the version of cancer, uterine or kidney, the silent killer of women of that time, whose bodies, having endured numerous childbirths in far from sterile conditions, often became a battlefield for infections and pathologies. The harem, for all its luxury, was a breeding ground for stress and microbes, overcrowding, stuffiness, dampness from the hammams, and drafts in the corridors. The treatment? It was the same as for any Ottoman elite, a ritual dance between hope and despair. Court physicians brought her healing syrups of pomegranate juice, decoctions of rare Persian herbs, powders of crushed stones. It did not help. In 1552, in a desperate attempt to deceive the illness, she left Topkapi and set out across the Bosphorus to Üsküdar. A change of air, water, view from the window. There she built a mosque, investing in stone, a plea for health. European diplomats watching the court keenly reported, "The Sultana is so weak she cannot rise from her bed, yet her mind and will govern the empire through pen and paper." She ruled, lying on silk pillows, while her letters bearing the Sultan's tura flew to Poland, Venice, France.
And as her body weakened, the political machine she had built over decades operated at its limit. These years were the apex of her influence and her most dangerous game. The game was for the most precious stake, the future of her bloodline on the throne. Shehzade Mustafa, the eldest son of Suleiman by Mahidevran, was the most likely heir, beloved by the army and the people. Her own sons, Selim and Bayezid, were younger. The story of Mustafa's execution in 1553 in the camp near Ereğli is not merely an episode of palace drama. It is a cold-blooded operation that turned the empire's future upside down. The rumors that later became facts in the mouths of European ambassadors and Janissary legends say she spent hours discussing the plan with her son-in-law, the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha.
She dictated letters to her daughter Mihrimah that were to reach the Sultan's hands at the right moment, letters where hints of Mustafa's betrayal took on flesh. She created for Suleiman a reality in which his son became a threat. And it worked. The triumph was complete, but its cost proved monstrous. The Janissaries' cry, "Give us back our Sultan," after Mustafa's execution, was a cry not only for the Shehzadeh, but for the old order that had collapsed. The shadow of poisoner and schemer fell upon Hurrem forever and gave birth to the central legend of her death. Triumph turned into a new rift. Now her own sons, Selim and Bayezid, began a war against each other. A mother's heart was torn between them. She rushed about, tried to reconcile them, sent out messengers, wrote admonitions, but ambition and fear were stronger. Yet even against the backdrop of this personal hell, her public life did not halt. She was a key diplomatic asset of the Porte, and in Istanbul itself she was in a hurry to leave a stone legacy. In 1557, the grand Hasseki Hurrem Sultan Hammam opposite Hagia Sophia was laid. Not just a bathhouse, but a declaration for eternity. I, a woman, am sewing my name forever into the very flesh of the imperial capital, right opposite the greatest temple. However, by 1557, little remained of the former Hurrem but a shadow. Courtiers whispered of a gray-haired woman with eyes hollow from pain, carried in closed litters from chamber to chamber. She was emaciated, racked by attacks, yet her gaze remained severe, and her will of iron.
Death came on April 15th, 1558. Not on a battlefield, not in a conspiracy, but in her own bedchamber in Topkapi, surrounded by doctors and likely her daughter Mihrimah. Suleiman, always reserved and inscrutable, displayed a grief that stunned contemporaries. He locked himself away for 3 days, refusing audiences in state affairs, mourning the woman who was to him not merely a wife, but a part of his very destiny. The official cause, recorded in documents, is laconic and dispassionate. After a long illness. No poisoning, no violence. But the seed of doubt, sown by her own hand in the affair of Mustafa, had already sprouted. She had too many enemies. Her illness was too strange and prolonged. Her departure was too convenient for certain parties. The symptoms, vomiting, pain, wasting, easily merged in the public mind with the picture of a slow poison. Thus was born the myth that would outlive the centuries. The serials version, which develops the notion of her poisoning, is merely an echo of that ancient whisper from the corridors of Topkapi. Forget for a moment the poisons and whispers in the corridors of Topkapi. The real story, told by archives and medical reports, has a different screenwriter, biology, and its plot is far more merciless than palace intrigues. Armed with microscopes and X-rays instead of chroniclers' quills, modern historians and doctors have conducted a real investigation. Their verdict: the death of Roxolana is not a criminal thriller, but a standard medical case for the 16th century. Historians set aside poetic hints and looked at Hürrem's final years through the dry lines of Hurrem documents. The conclusion was categorical. There is no place for poisons here. In the Ottoman dynasty, there was a much simpler and more traditional method for eliminating unwanted wives or mothers: the silk cord. Secret poisoning, especially of a sultana, was far too complicated and risky.
The 16th century in the Ottoman Empire was a paradox worthy of a great tragedy. At the peak of its territorial and cultural grandeur, beneath the minarets erected by Sinan, the state was helpless against invisible armies that cut people down more effectively than any Janissary attack. If political intrigue in the harem resembled a game of chess, the medicine of that era was more like a dice game with terrifying odds. Suleiman the Magnificent ruled the world he could see, but the world he could not see, the world of bacteria, viruses, and uncontrollably dividing cells, ruled him and his loved ones. The Topkapi harem, that gilded center of power and passion from an epidemiological point of view, was an ideal incubator. Overcrowding, constant stress, the absence of clear sanitary norms, and isolation from the outside world made it a biological time bomb. Here, pathogens from all over the world mixed, European, Asian, African, and against this enemy, both the Sultan's gold and the wisdom of Persian healers were powerless. The plague was an invisible diplomat crossing out destinies. It visited Istanbul with enviable regularity. Epidemics, dryly mentioned in the chronicles, flared up with apocalyptic cyclicity every 5 to 10 years. The 1520s carried away, by various estimates, up to 100,000 lives in the capital, and in 1551, when Hürrem's health had already developed a serious crack, a new wave engulfed the city. The symptoms were a theater of horror: fever, burning from within, and black buboes, which were a silent death sentence. Death came in 3 or 4 days. The Ottomans were not helpless. They knew about quarantine, appointed overseers to monitor the markets, and burned the belongings of the deceased. But religion and superstition often prevailed. Many saw in the plague not an infection, but divine punishment. Chroniclers noted with cold statistical precision a mortality rate of 20% of a neighborhood's population. For a woman whose illness, by all accounts, dragged on for years, the plague is an unlikely candidate. Its mechanism was swift and merciless, like the strike of an assassin's dagger. Hürrem, however, faded slowly, which is more like a siege than an assault.
Syphilis, a French gift to the heart of the empire. If the plague was a natural disaster, the French disease was an evil fruit of Ottoman-style globalization. It was likely imported after contacts with Europe, and in the closed world of the harem it found the perfect environment. It was a quiet companion of passion, a political saboteur penetrating the highest offices. The symptoms were insidious and stretched over time. Initial sores that healed, creating an illusion of recovery, were followed by agonizing pains in the bones and joints, and in the later stages, damage to the nervous system and grotesque tumors masquerading as cancer. The treatment was worse than the disease. Patients were literally poisoned with mercury and its vapors, leading to tooth loss, kidney damage, and nervous disorders. Statistics reconstructed from archives in the early 20th century are frightening. Up to a quarter of the Ottoman elite could have been infected. For Hürrem, syphilis is a dark horse. Chronic pain, general weakness, possible damage to internal organs, all of this aligns with descriptions of her ailment. But there is a nuance. The late stages of the disease were often accompanied by the characteristic collapse of the bridge of the nose, a saddle nose. Not a single source, even indirectly, hints at such a feature in the Sultana, whose political image and influence remained impeccable until the very end. Cancer was the secret resident of the harem, a diagnosis invisible to 16th century medicine. Physicians who read Avicenna knew the word sarak, or cancer, or tumor, and described its hardness, its resemblance to a crab's shell, and its incurability. But without an understanding of histology, without the possibilities of surgery, aside from the most risky and mutilating interventions, the lethality was 100%. It was a sentence passed by the body itself.
For the women of the harem, the risks were extreme. Frequent pregnancies and childbirths, chronic inflammatory diseases due to infections, stress of colossal intensity.
All this created a perfect storm for oncology. Suleiman's mother, Valide Sultan Aisha Hafsa, died in 1534 from an illness whose symptoms, wasting, pain, internal bleeding, are today confidently interpreted as cancer. This lies as the most probable key to unraveling Hurrem's death. The chronicles are unanimous on one point. Her illness was long, agonizing, and localized internally. Abdominal pain, wasting, weakness. These fragmentary accounts, stretched over years, scream of a systemic chronic process. Cancer of the kidney or reproductive organs fits this picture perfectly. Attempts at treatment were heroic and simultaneously horrifying. The medicine of the 16th century Ottoman Empire was a hybrid, patchwork system. The Islamic tradition, inherited from classical works, coexisted with Persian herbalism, folk Slavic or Caucasian recipes, and the latest, often dubious curiosities from Europe. Surgery was limited to amputations and lancing abscesses. Anesthesia did not exist. The concept of antisepsis was absent. An operation was often an act of desperation, bordering on murder. For women, the situation was exacerbated by the gender barrier. A male doctor could not examine a female patient directly. A diagnosis was made behind a curtain based on descriptions from maids or by checking the pulse. Treatment was prescribed blindly. Midwives delivered babies in conditions that would be considered unsanitary today. The harem, for all its luxury, was a health trap. Hurrem Sultan died in a world where the cause of death was more often a mystery or an act of God than a medical fact. Plague, syphilis, cancer, this is not merely a list of diseases. They are three faces of a single era. A swift pandemic, a slow reckoning for passion, and a mysterious internal malfunction against which there was no weapon. Her death, however romanticized it may seem in the series, was most likely prosaic and terrifying. A long farewell to a body that had become a prison, surrounded by healers who could only throw up their hands and offer yet another remedy, while life in the greatest empire of its time continued to boil outside the walls of Topkapi. In old chronicles, among the ornate phrases, specific symptoms flash: excruciating lower back pain, blood in the urine, rapid wasting. Put these puzzle pieces together and a picture begins to emerge. Cancer, most likely of the urinary tract or kidneys. 6 pregnancies, possible miscarriages or abortions common in the harem life of that time, created a perfect storm for such a pathology. Her body, which had borne the battle for power and the continuation of the dynasty, ultimately became the main field of defeat. American researchers went further in their conclusions. They applied statistics to Hurrem's case, statistics as merciless as a verdict. By the age of 50, nearly every second woman from the Ottoman elite died from uterine or cervical cancer. The reasons are banal and horrific. Infections transmitted within the vast, cramped collective of the harem, an almost complete lack of hygiene concepts, early onset of sexual activity. This is also evidenced by the desperate letters of her daughter Mihrema, where she speaks of her mother's unceasing torments. Not the sudden pain of poison, but a prolonged, methodical torture. But science did not stand still, conducting an almost detective-like retrospective diagnosis. Taking the same symptoms, scientists eliminated everything superfluous. Fever, possible with tumor disintegration. Ascites, fluid accumulation in the abdomen, a classic complication in late stages. The verdict sounded like a diagnosis from a modern medical history. Transitional cell carcinoma of the bladder. Rare, aggressive, absolutely fatal in a world where such a disease wasn't even heard of in fairy tales. And what of genetics? It contributed its own line to this scholarly debate. The project studying the DNA of the Ottomans brought a sensational detail. Descendants linked to the lineage of Hürrem were found to have mutations in genes that sharply increase the risk of breast and ovarian cancer.
Hurrem, a native of Galicia, could have received this fateful genetic break as a dowry from her Slavic ancestors, so the tragedy might have been inscribed in her from birth like an ancient curse, only a molecular one. The tuberculosis hypothesis, while seemingly logical against the backdrop of the era, consumption was a true scourge of the time, does not withstand close contact with the documents. The main stumbling block is a complete, deafening silence. Not in a single letter, ambassador's dispatch, or chronicle is there a hint of a debilitating cough, coughing up blood, or shortness of breath, those invariable companions of the pulmonary form of the disease. For an entourage so attentive to the Sultana's every breath, overlooking such vivid symptoms would have been impossible. Fever, however, is too general a symptom, accompanying dozens of illnesses, from malaria to sepsis caused by tumor disintegration.
A chronic infection like tuberculosis remains on the periphery of probable causes, more like the background noise of the era than the primary diagnosis. Its low rating among researchers is not a verdict, but a consequence of the strict rule of historical medicine. If the key symptoms are absent in the sources, there are no grounds for a confident diagnosis. It remains just one of many versions, a shadow of a possibility, but not the tangible reality of her long illness. Now let's move on to a narrative that is remarkably tenacious despite numerous refutations. If screenwriters were to write the death of Hurrem Sultan, they would undoubtedly choose poison. It is the perfect finale for the evil queen, poetic, concealed, full of symbolism. She, a master of intrigue, falls victim to the very shadow she herself cast. This rumor is not merely alive, it thrives because it offers a logical, dramatic, and morally satisfying conclusion. But let's dig deeper and see who propagated this black legend and why. When news of Hurrem's death arrived in 1558, the Venetian ambassador immediately concocted a story about a poisoned cup of coffee presented by a rival from the harem. The Polish resident, in his dispatches, hinted at the Persian origins of the poison. Why did they need this? To portray the Ottoman Empire as a revived ancient theater ruled by wild, irrational cruelty. A death by poison in the harem confirmed the European myth of Oriental despotism, where even the most powerful woman was not safe from a treacherous servant. It turned a political opponent into a tragic character, making them vulnerable and human in their depravity. Facts interested them far less than a juicy story for their reports. Within the empire itself, rumors fermented in the silence of the women's quarters of Topkapi. After the execution of Shehzade Mustafa in 1553, Mahidevran Sultan, exiled and driven mad with grief, became the perfect ghost for this story. Popular whispers immediately appointed her the chief poisoner. Allegedly, using old connections, she bribed someone from the staff to slip arsenic into the sherbet or rub poison onto Hurrem's belongings. But the most vivid version places the blame on her own daughter, Mihrimah Sultan, and her husband, the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha. The motive? To remove an aging and overly influential mother whose power had begun to hinder their own ambitions, especially in light of the struggle for the throne between her sons, Selim and Bayezid. But let's apply cold logic for a moment. If Hürrem had been poisoned with a fast-acting, potent toxin, her death would have been sudden and shocking. Yet all sources agree on one point. She was ill for a long time, for years. It was a chronic, debilitating illness, not a swift agony. If the poisoner had been Mahidevran or the Shah of Persia and Suleiman had believed it for even a second, the Sultan's revenge would have been terrible, public, and well documented. We would read of mass executions, tortures, and exemplary punishments. But the historical record is silent. On the contrary, Suleiman sank into quiet, personal grief. And most importantly, a death by poison in the 16th century was almost impossible to conceal from contemporaries when it concerned such a high-ranking personage. There would have been memoirs from physicians, suspicious confessions, rumors within the inner circle. But even the most hostile Ottoman chroniclers who disliked Hürrem did not dare to record an unverified rumor of poisoning in their works.
They confined themselves to vague hints, which in itself is telling. The poisoning theory is not a diagnosis. It is a legend, crafted from equal parts fear, hatred, and fascination. It is a way to simplify a complex, multifaceted figure into the archetype of the villainess who got her due.